Washington Journal continues.
We want to welcome to C-SPAN Jerry Baker, Washington Bureau Chief for the Financial Times, frequently here on C-SPAN. Thanks for being with us.
Pleasure.
How did Argentina get into its current situation?
Well, as with a lot of countries who get into serious economic difficulties, it was a combination of bad luck and bad management. Probably in this case, a sizable amount of bad management and a little bit of bad luck. It really goes back, I think, to the problems that Argentina had back in the 1980s. Like many countries in Latin America, Argentina was suffering from rampant inflation in the 1980s. You had the situation where, inflation was running in the thousands of percent a year, where it means you'd go into a store in the morning to pay for something, and later that evening the price would have risen by 20%. They set in place, and they did a really good job, and this in some ways is the tragedy of what Argentina and other countries have done. They set in place, they took really the kind of tough, wrenching measures that you have to take to get inflation out of the system. They cut government spending, they cut the deficits that they'd had, they put in place a foreign exchange rate system by pegging their currency, the peso as it was, very hard, firmly to the US dollar. So that it would never move. That would mean that they would import, as it were, from the United States the kind of rigid inflation, very low inflation economic conditions that the US had. That required a lot of pain, a lot of effort. They had that system. They got all that in place in the early 1990s, and it worked. The problem is that, as often happens, it's a question. It's rather like generals fighting the last war. When inflation ceased to be a problem, they were stuck with this system that they had, particularly on the exchange rate. They built up their economy started to deteriorate, as a lot of economies did in the region in the mid-1990s. And as I say, they kept a system that, while it was great for fighting inflation, while it was ideal for dealing with the crisis that they had 15 years ago, was no longer appropriate as inflation became less of a problem, and what the real problem then was a weak economy, and they were stuck with that system, and they went into recession. And as often happens in those situations, your refusal to change the system, the refusal to deal with the new conditions that exist, simply made matters worse, and you went into a downward spiral, and I'm afraid the consequences are what we've seen over the last year.
One of the headlines Washingtonians are waking up to this morning from the Washington Times, Argentina beyond the brink, pointing out that the country is facing $132 billion in default on its loans. And the story says Argentina is in a free fall. Its economy is shattered. It can't pay its huge debts at home or abroad. Its political leaders are befuddled and desperate. Military leaders are grumbling. There's looting, rioting, and death in the streets, and nobody sees the end of it yet. Fair analysis?
Yeah, very fair analysis. That's exactly the situation that seems to be there. And what's perhaps most worrying of all is that the new president, they've now been in this extraordinary position of having 5 presidents in the last month. The new president, who probably has got a better chance of surviving than some of his immediate predecessors, seems to be committed to a program that would really turn back the clock, turn back the economic clock that all countries have fortunately moved in the right direction with in the last few years. That is moving the right way to move towards openness, towards free markets, towards privatization, towards allowing the market to operate. This new president seems to be rejecting all that. He's actually said it doesn't work, that system. He opposes that model. He wants to put in place trade protection. He wants to possibly do some renationalizations. They want to put in place price controls, and you could really have a very, very nasty turn for the worse in Argentina as a result of what this new government may do.
The editorial in your publication on Friday, the Financial Times, says the economic, financial, and political crisis in Argentina, once a poster child for economic reform and the so-called Washington Consensus, raises once more the question of whether emerging economies and the international financial markets can mix. The editorial goes on to talk about the bond market. For those who are not familiar on how all of this intersects, can you explain?
All countries around the world, all governments around the world need to borrow money to maintain their, you've heard a lot about that with what's been going on in the US with Gene Sperling for the last hour. All countries around the world need to borrow money to keep themselves operating, to pay for the vital public services that they have to provide. It's very important to make sure that spending doesn't get, that borrowing and your spending and borrowing, the gap between spending and taxes and the amount you need to borrow doesn't get out of control. When they borrow, most governments have access to, they borrow that money not by borrowing the money as you would go to your bank manager and borrow the money from the bank, but they borrow it from the international financial markets, that is from the bond markets. They sell bonds to investors around the world. That includes the likes of you and me in the form of kind of things like the pension funds and 401ks that people would have. They would buy bonds in countries around the world, and what happens is they hope to borrow that money at a reasonable rate of interest. The investors around the world take the bonds, but they have the investors. The point is the investors have to take the risk on those bonds. If the government at some point is going to get into so much trouble that it can't repay its debt, first of all, the interest rates are going to rise because the investors are going to demand a higher and higher rate of return on their investments, and then at some point you get into this vicious circle where the interest rate rise so much, the burden of paying that debt rises so much on the country that it comes close to not being able to pay those debts at all. And that is the position that Argentina's now in. That means that millions of investors around the world have Argentine government bonds, which are worth only a fraction of what they were worth when they made the original investment.
Our guest is Gerard Baker. He likes to be called Jerry. Our phone lines are open. If you live in the eastern half of the country, 202-737-0001. For our viewers out west, 202-737-0002. And if you're watching us in Canada, Mexico, or elsewhere overseas, 202-628-0205. Can you explain Argentina as a country? How many people live there? What type of government does it have? What does it produce?
Argentina's been a very successful model of political and economic reform in the last 20 years. It's had a tragic history in many ways over a longer period. At the turn of the century, Argentina, which is the second largest country in South America after Brazil, it's right at the bottom of South America, a long strip along the sort of southeast limb, as it were, of South America. At the beginning of the last century, at the beginning of the 20th century, it was one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It was phenomenally successful economically, well developed. It had great resources, minerals, particularly silver. Hence the name of the country, Argentina, which comes from the Spanish and the Latin for the word silver. Buenos Aires, its capital, was known as the Paris of the South. It was one of the most elegant and luxurious cities in the world at the time. It was an extreme success story. Then, as many countries did, of course, in Latin America, went through big problems throughout most of the 20th century. The problems really got worse in the 1970s, and had a series of course, well, in fact, you can go back, of course, to the 1950s and 1960s with Juan Perón, the president, and Eva Perón, his famous Evita, his famous wife, and the political problems that began there, constant battles with the internal disputes with the military. And in the 1970s, a series of a military coup and a series of military governments, and that's when things, as they did in much of Latin America, really started to go wrong. Terrible human rights record. They, of course, invaded the Falkland Islands in South Atlantic in 1982, which was British, British owned. The British military went and recaptured them, and that led to the fall, actually, of the military governments. And that was where things actually started to go right for Argentina. The military governments collapsed. They got in place some new reformist governments, some democratic governments. A lot of great democratic reforms were made, and then these economic reforms that I was speaking about were also made. And as I say, as we said in our paper on Friday, the country was 5 years or so ago a poster child for successful emerging market economic and political reform. And unfortunately, it's been in the last few years that's fallen apart.
Our guest, born in London, worked for a number of years at the BBC, and since 1996 has been in the Washington bureau of the Financial Times. New Orleans, good morning.
How are you?
Fine, thank you. Go ahead with your question.
Okay. The Argentina pegged to the dollar, and then Brazil flooded their market with their devalued currency and put all their people out of work, and that's what happened there. And I see a big problem internationally is debt and deflation. You have debt and deflation, and Japan is hurting their economy. It's hurt Argentina. It's actually the United States right now, during the Clinton administration, debt skyrocketed, personal, government, etc. And I guess I'm going to ask you about the United States, if you don't mind. Paul Volcker talked about a good solution to get our economy going. He talked about one-time spending programs that would get the maybe put new technology, one-type spendings that are not long-term type spendings. The Democrats want us to do a program similar to Indonesia, which was they put twice as money per capita per and just spending, just put money in people's hands, but it didn't help Indonesia. The Republicans want to give money to international corporations that don't make things in the United States. I think we should have programs where they'll create jobs in the United States, one-time things, but things that are not, they'll help create technology and productivity for our country. I just wanted to get your opinion if you think that would help us better than these one-time spending programs of the Democrats and the programs where they're going to give AMT money to the big corporations.
I'll stop you there. Thanks for the question.
No, on Argentina, as I said at the beginning, Argentina's problems were a combination of bad management, principally bad management, I think, and bad luck. And one of the things that you mentioned, bad luck, was the decision by Brazil a few years ago to devalue its own currency. What that means, of course, for economies in the region, for any competitor countries with Brazil, is that Brazilian exports became much cheaper. Argentine imports relative to Brazilian exports were much more expensive. That undercut, as you say, quite rightly, much of Argentina's export sector, and indeed much of the broader economy, and that's absolutely fair. Although the problem really was already in place to a large extent with some irresponsible government spending programs, and also the failure after that to recognize the need to change that currency system. Argentina stuck with the so-called convertibility policy of retaining the exchange rate of the peso at absolute parity with the dollar, absolutely level with the US dollar, and it wouldn't change that policy. It is now going to change that policy. Announced it last week. It should have done it a long time ago. On the question of the US economy, I don't want to get into that because I know we're on Argentina, but I think what you need, I'm not so sure about governments getting involved in sponsoring one particular type of investment against another or providing funds supposedly to boost productivity. I think government should focus on the long term, getting the long-term fiscal position right, basically keeping out of people's way, actually making sure that the balance of government spending and taxes is right. That's a political decision for the people to make, but then to make sure that once that decision has been made, that the government is not intruding overly in financial markets, that it's not actually that it's living within its means, that it's not doing irresponsible things. I think that's much more sensible to take a longer approach rather than to try and pick winners and get involved in economic management like that.
The op-ed page of this morning's Baltimore Sun takes a look at, as Jerry Baker said, the 5 presidents of Argentina within the span of 2 weeks. We'll get a call from New York City. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Baker. You already touched briefly on the military. Do you think there's any possibility of the military again taking over if this crisis continues?
From what I hear from my colleagues and from others in Buenos Aires at the moment, there is clearly a risk. The country is in turmoil, and we will see this week when the new the new government starts to implement its economic reforms, in particular the devaluation of the currency, which will hit people extremely hard. It will wipe out a large part of the Argentine middle class's savings, and we will see then just how much pain there is and how much of a sense of political crisis and a demand for political change there is. At the moment, from what I hear, from what I see there, the military seems to be in the background. There are some worrying rumbles about what some of the military leaders are thinking, and some talk among some commentators that maybe a bit of military discipline is needed once again to restore order to the country. But at the moment, that most people seem to think that's not a likely situation. But clearly, this is a very fluid crisis. Clearly, the situation is going to get worse before it gets better, and that's always those conditions are always ripe for very unpleasant things to happen.
Another article from the Sunday papers. Anthony DePalma writes this morning in the New York Times about the situation in Argentina and quotes Eduardo Duhalde, who is the new president of the country, saying it's time to tell the truth. Argentina is bankrupt. Argentina is destroyed. This model has destroyed everything. Next call is New York City. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Mr. Baker, isn't it clear to you by now that this IMF policy do not work anywhere? They have not worked in Mexico. They have not worked in Brazil. They have not worked in Indonesia, Malaysia. They have not worked in Russia. How can you expect these fledgling economies to open up their countries to United States domination and exploitation? Open up their army of workers to our exploitation and survive. Isn't it time that we change our policy? And isn't Argentina right that maybe they should turn away from this globalization, which is really the globalization of poverty?
There are two criticisms from directly opposite sides, actually, of the role of the IMF and the US, which is, of course, the biggest country, the biggest shareholder in the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which is the body that exists to try and help countries in which get into financial difficulties. The first criticism is you put very eloquently, which is that the IMF does this and the US backs it by demanding that those countries follow policies that are driven towards austerity, that involve essentially putting up taxes if and cutting spending because they have to get budget deficits down. They often require higher interest rates because they require that's less of a problem these days, but it used to be when they had to get inflation out of the system. They also require open trade policies, which again, as you say, is sometimes quite controversial. However, the other side is exactly the opposite, that the IMF the IMF is too easy on these countries, that the IMF and the US let these countries essentially do what they were going to do anyway and pour billions of dollars into a black hole. So I'm not sure. I certainly don't agree with you on your point. I think the second point may have greater validity. The fact is, globalization clearly does produce pain. It produces a lot of pain for some countries, for a lot of people. However, if you look at the broader sweep of what's gone on in the world over the last 25 years, the process of globalization has been countries that have embraced globalization, that have embraced global markets, have done much, much better at reducing poverty, at improving their economic condition than countries that have turned their back on it. And unfortunately, if Argentina turns its back on this global economy, then the risks are that Argentina will be in an even worse condition than it is now.
Another description of the events in Argentina from The Economist, this week's edition, describing Argentina's new president as an economic fireman who will have little room to maneuver. Next call is Hallie, Michigan. Good morning. You're on C-SPAN. Good morning, caller.
Yes. Are you there?
We sure are. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Yes. How long has this been brewing there in Argentina? And I would just like to know, how do these people got in there to do what they did in the parliament or the president there? I mean, to take over and cause all these, different presidents, you know what I'm saying, all these different presidents in such a little time. How do these people get up there to do this? This is what I don't understand, and I'm afraid that it might happen here in America. I'm scared of that for our children. I'm not scared, but for our children.
Thank you, caller. Jerry Baker?
I don't think there's any chance of it happening in America. What happened in Argentina is that the country's been in recession. I mean, how long has this been going on? Well, it's been gradually getting worse, significantly worse, over the last 3 or 4 years, really, when the country's been in recession. The process has accelerated in the last year or two, and particularly in the last year. And the problem is, the reason we've had this terrible political crisis is because governments stuck with policies that were politically acceptable, that seemed to be popular, that they did not take the tough choices that really have to be taken. That in the end, it is hard. I mean, there's no denying it. It's not an easy option to devalue the currency and to reduce the wealth of the country, or to make the kind of tough decisions on spending and on the overall budget deficit that you need to do. It's very hard, but in the end, history has shown again and again that if you do it in a timely way, if you get it over with, if you get the pain without the way at a relatively early stage, you're going to save an awful lot of pain earlier on. And Argentina could have, at any point in the last 3 years, taken tougher measures, taken the right measures to get its economy back into shape, and unfortunately, for political reasons, it didn't.
And as the Washington Times points out, this past Thursday, Argentina missed the first of what is expected to be many payments, $28 billion in bond payments. Is it impacting other parts of the world, other parts of South America?
So far it isn't. We've actually, the big fear was that just as we had in 1998, you remember when the Asian crisis, when a lot of Asian economies faced quite similar problems. They had high debt and problems with currencies. It spread rapidly. It spread like wildfire through Asia. Financial markets in the US were affected because everybody was losing money in all these Asian markets. Financial markets fell very sharply in the US. This was in the end of 1998, as this wildfire spread around the world, and people were very concerned that the entire world was going to go into some kind of financial meltdown. That really hasn't happened this time, and I think that is the good news for the rest of the world. And I think that, to a large extent, that's because people have seen this coming for a very, very, very long time. I mean, it's not often that crises usually unfold in a completely unexpected way. Anybody who's been following Argentina could almost have given you a blow-by-blow account of what would happen a year ago. People knew that this was a system that was really not going to be sustainable, so the investors made all their decisions on the basis of their expectations that this was eventually going to fall apart.
What about Brazil, Chile, or Ecuador, where they use the American dollar?
There is, again, there doesn't seem to be an immediate economic impact. We'll have to see. Argentina will devalue its currency. That will not be good news for the other countries in the region, because Argentine exports will then become less expensive, and just as Argentina suffered when Brazil devalued its currency a few years ago, other countries in the region might suffer there. But there is so far very little direct financial impact. There's very little. Investors are being pretty good at differentiating between the specific problems of Argentina and the broader economic conditions in the region. So there isn't as yet much sign of this crisis spreading. And if it can be dealt with, if it can be isolated in Argentina, there's a good chance the world economy won't be too seriously affected.
You talked about minerals and other natural resources. What about products? What does Argentina produce?
Argentina, well, it continues to produce some minerals. It has it actually exports relatively small. I mean, it's the amount of produce that it actually exports is relatively small compared to its as a proportion of its overall economic output. A lot of agricultural products, of course. Famously, it's a large part of its exports are agriculture. But
when you go to the store, though, you'll see a lot of wine from Chile, a lot of fruits and vegetables from Chile. What's the difference between these two countries? Why can a country like Chile survive financially and have the success that Argentina has been unable to have?
Well, Chile has not had the. Chile has been has put in place an economic system, particularly for dealing with its budget, with its budget problems at a much earlier stage. Indeed, it was one while the human rights in Chile were being ignored, and the kind of treatment of the Pinochet regime of civil rights was absolutely appalling. There was what the Pinochet regime did do was to put in place very tight fiscal constraints, and actually kept the budget deficit under control. So going back over a long way, Chile has stronger economic policies than Argentina. Argentina has not really been able to get to grips with those problems.
Next call from Universal City, Texas. Good morning. You're on C-SPAN.
Good morning. Hello. How are you?
Good morning.
I have been watching some of your program previously as well as this hour, and I feel like the Argentinian problem is, huge. But I think as Americans, we should be wary of our own policies that could create similar situations. You spoke of the middle class losing all of their savings because of the situation. The idea that they've spent all of the money because they won all of these programs, but then yet they're not collecting the money. Of course, that's taxes. We have a similar problem in this country, I believe, because we are not making the idea that we have to pay for these services we want. The American public wants these services just like every country does. And unless we're willing to pay the taxes that it takes and to listen to the previous, I sat down and I did figures from 1980, 1990, 1999 on what we pay in taxes. I have the books that go all the way back, and we pay less in the middle class today in taxes than we've paid in the last 20 years. And I believe the 8 years of Clinton administration was very instrumental in the middle class having a better way of life. And the whole deal with the shift of the present administration is to shift that burden back down to the middle class. An average person making, $35,000 a year in 1999 paid $5,359 in taxes versus $5,785 under President Bush, the father.
I'm going to stop you there and get a response. Thank you for the call.
Let's be very clear. There is no danger, I think, short of some kind of a transformation of economics. There is no danger of the United States being in the kind of condition that the Argentine economy is in. It's simply unimaginable. And yet the lessons of what went on in Argentina, the broader lessons of what go on in Argentina, do have some relevance to everybody. I mean, they do have relevance here in the United States too. And it's partly about being ready to take the kind of tough decisions that you need to take to get your budget, in particular, to get the government's budget in order. And the caller's right. I think a lot of important things were done over the last 8 years that did get the federal budget, the U.S. federal budget, back into some kind of shape, some kind of condition. 10 years ago, the United States was headed for, it had huge budget deficits and was headed for even larger ones, and was headed for what was in the long run, not in any kind of form of like Argentina, but what would in the long run cause very serious economic difficulties for it. And the US got that budget deficit under control, turned it around to surpluses, and there's a very important lesson there for the US for the future.
A couple more minutes, 2 more calls. First, the boyhood home of Bill Clinton, Hope, Arkansas. Good morning.
Yes, sir. A few years back, I was considering investing in land in Argentina. I spent a lot of time studying that country and its past policies. As you have said, it was a very prosperous country up until really the end of the Second World War. And when Juan Perón and Evita Perón took over, and they remind me a lot of Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton because they were socialists, but they were national socialists, and they put in all kinds of social welfare programs, same thing the Clintons want to do. And the long and the short of it is that they did the same thing to Argentina that our 2 major political parties are doing to this country. They're using tax money to buy votes, and they're bankrupting the United States, just like Evita and Juan started the bankrupting of a very rich country, Argentina. There's a lot of lessons in Argentina for this country if we'll look at it and learn from it. And I disagree with you when you say the country of America is not in any danger of having the same kind of financial problems Argentina has. Our national debt, admitted national debt, is $6 trillion. Theirs is on $132 billion. Now, Argentina is 10 times as big as Texas. As you said, it's the second biggest country in South America. It was a very prosperous country until these cradle-to-grave socialists who dominate both major political parties in this country and dominated all the political scenery in Argentina got in control of that country and spin them into bankruptcy.
Thank you, caller.
Yeah, there's a lot of what you say. There were serious errors in economic policy that began with the Perons and continued right up until the early 1990s. Again, though, I would return to the question of the U.S. and whether or not the U.S. is in the same kind of danger. It's true the U.S. has a very large public debt, but of course the U.S. economy is considerably larger. The U.S. The actual total amount of debt relative to the size of the U.S. economy is much smaller than in the case of many developing countries, many countries in Latin America, in particular Argentina. And also politically, the United States has a long history of stable democratic government, going back 220 years, essentially, or at least 150 40 years since the Civil War, where there's been no significant intervention by the military. There is great legitimacy of the popular government. It has great widespread support. There is, and indeed, it has a thriving economy and has had for most of the last 100 years. So this is not sure the US has economic problems. I don't think there's any question about that. And sure, there are some lessons in what went on in Argentina, but nobody should think that what's happened in Argentina in the last year is remotely likely to happen in the US.
Our last call comes to us from Los Angeles. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for taking the call. When you say it's unimaginable that the American economy might endure what the Argentines are going through, I wonder what might be imaginable in terms of any kind of radically different economic models from what we have now. I wonder if anyone or you, the guest, may have heard of or read George Bernard Shaw's Intelligent Woman's Guide to Socialism and Capitalism. And it just seems like we only hear about one way of doing business now. I'm wondering, can you imagine models where the government, because of the speed of communications, can do business on a pay-as-they-go basis rather than taxing in advance, and or just any kind of radically different models whereby employers, and this is what I think is fundamentally most important in economies, is can you imagine employers treating employees the way they would treat their own family members in their business? I mean, can they spread the money around and make things good for everybody? Isn't that what a good economy is all about?
Well, a good economy is about creating as much income as you can, and then, as you say, then it's up to society to determine what to do with that income, how it's spread around. That's absolutely that's an option. The way you've described it is an option for societies to do it. It's the way that some societies have tried to do it. To be honest with you, socialism, which was the major alternative to capitalism, or was touted as the major alternative to capitalism for a very long time, plainly didn't work. It plainly resulted in some political and economic slavery and a much worse economic performance. I'm not suggesting for one moment that the way that the US does things is necessarily therefore perfect or absolutely the right way to do it and better than all others, but I do think that it's proved itself to be, over a long period, the best way of creating wealth, the best way of generating long-term prosperity, and indeed of doing so in an environment that creates political stability and keeps most of the people relatively content.
So as a way of summarizing for the short term, what's next for Argentina's new president, who took over January 1st?
The new reform program that he announced last week will come into place, will start coming into place this week. And in particular, the first big thing will be the effect of the new currency, the devaluation of the peso, which will wipe out 30 to 40% of the value in international terms of Argentina's value, essentially of Argentina's value in international terms. That will wipe out a large part of the savings of ordinary Argentines. There will be tremendous stresses on the banks. The banks are going to lose a lot of money. They're going to be asked to take a lot of the pain because they're going to have to honour the deposits of a lot of ordinary Argentines, while they're going to lose. While the value of their own costs, the money they have to pay internationally is going to remain unchanged. So there is going to be in the next week the first real test of this of these reforms and the sustainability and the viability of the new Argentine government.
Jerry Baker, whose byline appears in the Financial Times, he's been with that publication for 5 years now. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Coming up in just a moment, we will speak to the editor-in-chief of this publication, The American Spectator. C-SPAN's Washington Journal continues on this Sunday morning.